Very important issue at this time of year. Lots of kids trying to get into schools, parents anxious, and there are many oversubscribed schools in and around Cape Town. Schools that have way too many applicants for the places that they have. There's a parliamentary committee putting pressure on the Western Cape Education Department to release data on who is appealing against rejection from schools. They're looking to see if there's racial bias in that decision. Now, I have enormous sympathy for schools and for the principals in particular in this position. There is immense emotional pressure on them. How should they go about this? How do they go about it? It's an important issue. I'd like to hear from you on it. 072 567 1567. WhatsApps and voice notes. Give me a call. 021 446 0567. We're talking about how high schools, oversubscribed high schools, make the decision on who to admit and who not to admit. Let's start with the Western Cape Education Department. Bronagh Hammond joins me now, their spokesperson. Bronagh, very good afternoon to you.
Hi, good afternoon, Mike, and to your listeners.
Whose responsibility is this? Is it the department that sets the rules, or is it each individual school or governing body?
Well, we ultimately guided by the South African Schools Act and the National Admissions Policy, and obviously we try and implement what the criteria in terms of what information schools can, parents can submit on our online system, take out all the previous discriminatory practices, like, for example, how much does how much do the parents earn, so that we make it as fair as possible. Every school gets the same kind of information, and then they can determine it using their admission policies. I think that's where the difference comes in, is that the school governing body of each school has an admission policy that they have determined, and there might be different criteria from school A to school B, depending on certain factors. Some schools take into account, for example, siblings. Other schools take into account proximity to the school. And then obviously when you have schools like focus schools, for example, where you have maths and science criteria, they will look at those marks. So there's various factors that come into play, but ultimately it is the school governing body that determines who is admitted into their school based on that criteria and the applications received.
So the school has a degree of flexibility to set its own policy as long as the information it is seeking is within the requirements you set online.
Well, the information we're seeking is in terms of the requirements, and then based on their admission policy that they then also don't follow any discriminatory practices, and this is in line with the South African Schools Act. And we try and monitor that as far as possible in terms of the code of conduct of school and the admission policies, that it is in line with the South African Schools Act. And obviously if we notify that there's something that we find that isn't in line, then we will address it with the school.
All right, but what do you mean by isn't in line? What practices are they not allowed to do? Are they allowed to use siblings? Are they allowed to use, if their parents are old boys or old girls, things like that?
Well, for example, if you're not a focus school, you can't test the learner, or we don't have requirements in terms of interviewing the learner directly and their parents, or asking for information regarding their financial status, which many of our fee-paying schools, that they rely on fees, and so therefore that would be discriminatory. Then, some schools take into account siblings. Some schools take into account if your parents were also at that school, proximity to the school. We've got various types of schools in this city. In the City Bowl, for example, they don't take into account proximity. You've got schools like Sea Point High School, Cape Town High School. Those are generally known as commuter schools. So learners are traveling from all over the city, from Khayelitsha, Langa, Milnerton to those schools. But in other areas, they will take learners from the proximity first, and maybe a certain percentage from outside as well.
Is racial balance part of the requirement?
No, certainly not. Obviously, schools would like to have a bit more in terms of transformation. Our former Model C schools do, and we've seen that over the years for sure. But ultimately, race shouldn't be a factor. But then they will take into account other academic requirements, sporting achievements. There's a whole range of criteria that is used, and they generally have a point scoring system that they will look at and then determine their candidates through that. But yes, I too have sympathy for our schools because, some of our schools, like a school like Claremont High School, is receiving 4,700 applications for about 120 to 140 spaces. And that is an incredible administrative burden. And it's also quite it's very difficult for the school when you've got, over 4,000 parents that are disappointed that their child hasn't gotten into that school and knocking on your door and crying.
Bronagh, we're going to leave it there as the line gets bad. Thank you very much indeed. Bronagh Hammond, WCED spokesperson. Let's go to Ridwan Ahmed from NAPTOSA now, the Professional Teachers Organisation. Ridwan, a very good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, and good afternoon to the listeners.
How in your view, does this system work as against how it should work?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. I think we've raised this, obviously, with the head of education within our multilateral processes. And we think that, the BELA has now come about, and the BELA really also addresses the notion of the admission policies and oversight that, in fact, the provincial head of education department has. So what we're saying is that all these admission requirements developed or policies developed by the school governing bodies should be tabled to the head of education or the head of department, to make sure that it is in line with those criteria that Bronagh Hammond mentioned earlier on. As far as the issue, for example, the notion of differentiated criteria, we don't think there should be such a thing as differentiated criteria. I mean, it becomes exclusionary. Another factor which we haven't looked at, for example, is whether school fees becomes a determining factor. And then on the issue of a racial balance, whilst we are saying and whilst there is an indication that it should not be a requirement, we are aware that some schools do have a percentage set aside for racial balance in this particular instance.
Isn't there a virtue in schools having individual liberties in this area? A school is an entity. It's not a department. It's not part of a system. Shouldn't the school be allowed to thrive and work in its own way?
Yeah, well, I mean, that is why we have the guideline in terms of the South African Schools Act and these admission policies. But what we are saying is that there shouldn't be a differentiated criteria. If you want to apply it, it must be across the board. And whilst, for example, we agree with the WCD that it should be, in line with their SASA and the admission policies, certainly leaves, ground for some further engagement on this particular issue. Whilst we want to acknowledge, the rights of school governing bodies, but it certainly cannot be limitless.
Thanks very much indeed. That is Ridwan Ahmed from NAPTOSA, the Professional Teachers Organisation. We've heard from the WCED.